Welcome back. So what I want to ask you is this. Let's just turn to the African solution. It's often spoken about. I mean, how much confidence do we have when somebody like President Mugabe talks about a solution, which is an African solution? We know what he dealt with regard to the SADC tribunal. I mean, they just rejected that.
Yes. Well, there's
so
a proposed...
I mean, there's no... what I'm trying to ask is, I hear all sorts of people saying, well, that's quite right. But then the question is, how are we ever going to get a viable African solution?
Okay, well, I think maybe let's preface it by saying that these crimes are happening in the continent. And whatever mechanisms can be availed to deal with these crimes, we should go ahead and support these mechanisms. There is a proposed African Court of Justice in Human and People's Rights. It's a court that has yet to come into force. It hasn't opened its doors, but in the future, perhaps this court will open its doors. There are certain limitations as there are now, and it was mentioned before in terms of the amendments that were proposed last year at the African Union summit in Malabo, which sort of vitiate a lot of the gains that we hoped such a court would do. For example, the immunity for heads of state and government. It would be impossible to try current leaders, heads of state and government in this court. So that's a very big a problem, and unfortunately we cannot get the court.
So if one looks at the idea of having an African court, given what is being suggested by Noel, I mean, it was not being suggested, what you said in relation to the protocol, that you're going to immunize a whole category of rulers from any kind of jurisdiction. What confidence do ordinary people have by saying, if we don't actually strengthen our links to the ICC, rulers who may well commit atrocious crimes against humanity will get off scot-free?
Unfortunately, with the current setup, the legal framework, those leaders will never see a courtroom in the African court.
Is the position that bleak? Can I sort of end the program now, as it were, saying, I mean, this is like so desperate that, Professor, I mean...
No, fortunately, we still have the ICC. So, I mean, there are attempts to get out of the ICC through these mechanisms about establishing, African mechanisms that immunize...
Isn't Mugabe encouraging people just to basically, essentially cancel their commitments to the Rome Treaty?
I mean, there is an attempt, there has been attempts to actually get Africans to move out of, to get out of the ICC. But I'm saying that's a political statement. That's an AU, I mean, the AU itself is not really a friend of the ICC. And they have made it very clear that they would prefer that the ICC leaves Africa alone.
Correct.
But I think, as we said from the outset, those decisions are not actually made at the AU. These are individual country decisions,
all right, so
when you sign or you don't sign.
So let me ask you this. Is there any possibility, realistic possibility? I mean, we saw what happened with Kenya. I mean, what possibility is there of holding leaders accountable to atrocious human rights violations? I'm not suggesting that the Kenyan president was guilty. You know, that was a trial that was going to happen. I'm saying, but we know there are. The question is, what happens then? Is the ICC never going to really be able to deal with this because there won't be sufficient cooperation from the various African states, and the whole position becomes hugely bleak?
No, the Kenya story is actually two stories. One is that the President Uhuru, the ICC has withdrawn the charges against him, because they couldn't find sufficient evidence. Yeah. But the other story is that there are ongoing trials of the Vice President and somebody else. They are continuing, yeah. So, I mean, you could argue that the withdrawal of the charges actually delegitimizes the ICC because it was very gung-ho about getting him. Yeah, but on the other hand, there is still a process that is ongoing. And the ICC operates within a very difficult international environment and a local environment where the head of state has been indicted. And in the Kenyan case, there are a lot of stories about, whether evidence was presented to the ICC and so on.
Can I ask you this? Trying to frame it, in a sense, in terms of our history. I mean, we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission because we accepted in South Africa that Nuremberg trials, or criminal trials, for people who committed crimes against humanity, we must always remember that apartheid was a crime against humanity, shouldn't be brought before the criminal process because impunity was a better route. And I know that there's been a turn to anti-impunity, right, through international law. The real question, which means criminalisation, I mean, is criminalisation, even through the ICC, a viable alternative for the politics in Africa?
I think that's a very important question, and it's a very important debate that's going on right now to say what should transitional states do, especially those that have just gone through massive human rights violations, either by way of conflict or whatever the cause might be, but the result being there are certain individuals who are responsible for those violations that would have taken place. So the question then is, do you want to go the amnesty route or do you want to go the impunity route? And there are two schools of thought. One school is of the view that amnesties are important in that they bring together people, and that's more or less like the South African model, where you have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where there are those heinous crimes, then certain decisions must be made and prosecution should take place. And then there are those which say there must be, accountability for all crimes that have been committed, and that accountability is important in order to ensure that these crimes are not committed again. Where do you come down? I think our view as Amnesty International is that there must be accountability. Impunity should not be allowed to happen, because if impunity is allowed to take place, it will just recur, and it will allow those who have perpetrated these international crimes to get away with that. And societies will be traumatized, and there will be no closure, because accountability also allows closure and allows people to move on from those crimes that would have happened.
But we did that.
Well,
we are poster child for the impunity route.
Well, there's a place for several ways, or rather I should say that there isn't just one way of dealing with the past. So South Africa chose the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the Truth and Reconciliation model, to deal with the crimes of apartheid, etc. But we're living in a day and age now when we cannot allow amnesty for international crimes. And so had we, or had positions changed, that now South Africa is dealing today with what happened in the past, the amnesties perhaps would not have
and how then would we have ever got to where we got to? Because you would have had a powerful army of people who would have had a vested interest to carry on fighting if they knew that if they gave up, they'd have to be the criminal court.
Well, sentiments today are that because there was no accountability in South Africa to some
we are
respects,
in the position we are.
Then there's a position that we are in now. And technically, there should be a whole range of mechanisms that should be employed at the same time for a state to deal with the past.
All right, we'll come back to that. I'm being told I've got to take another break, and indeed I'm very dutiful in that regard, so we're taking a break.